He wasn't invited to his own son's wedding, he was billed for it. $80,000 broken down like a corporate invoice, 50 grand for a mansion rental, 20 for lobster and champagne, 10 for a Maui honeymoon suite. At the bottom, his son's smug handwriting sneered, "Be grateful I let you contribute." The father sat frozen at his kitchen table, the paper cutting deeper than any knife, his love reduced to a receipt. Rage didn't explode. It hardened cold and sharp into something far more dangerous. Before we continue, subscribe and tell us where you're watching from, because what happens next will leave you stunned. Stephen tore the envelope with the quiet anticipation of a man who had been waiting far too long for a reason to hope. He imagined polished cardstock, elegant script announcing a date, a venue, maybe even a request for him to walk his only son down the aisle. Instead, a thick stack of papers slid onto the table with the sterile precision of a bank statement. His eyes locked on the numbers, each line item hammering into him like blows he couldn't block. $50,000 for a mansion near Lexington Gardens, manicured like royalty's playground. $20,000 for catering a spread of lobster and imported wines, as if his son had forgotten he grew up on pot roast and beans. $10,000 for a Maui honeymoon suite, a place Stephen knew his boy had never earned. The grand total, $80,000. At the bottom, in handwriting that once scrawled birthday cards and Father's Day notes, sat the words that split his chest open. "Be grateful I let you contribute." The paper trembled in his hand as if the ink itself carried poison. His first thought was disbelief, a stunned fog pressing down on his skull. He blinked, reread each number, convinced he had misunderstood. But the figures stayed sharp, unyielding. He set the papers down only to pick them up again, as though each glance might reveal some hidden joke. There was no joke. This was no invitation. This was a demand. The chair creaked beneath him as he leaned back, the silence of his modest kitchen magnified by the insult in front of him. On the wall, a faded photograph of Kevin as a boy smiled back at him, gap-toothed and innocent, holding a baseball bat too big for his hands. He remembered that day, remembered the way his son had looked at him with unshakable trust. Now that same boy had become a man who treated his father not as family, not as blood, but as an account balance. The heartbreak pressed down heavier than the disbelief. His throat tightened, a dull ache blooming there, as he thought of Elena, gone 9 years now. She would have wept at this. She would have scolded Kevin with that quiet but firm voice that could still any tantrum. She had been the glue, the warmth, the one who reminded both of them what mattered. Without her, the bond had frayed until now it snapped. Stephen pressed a hand against his chest, not because of pain, but because the silence of the house felt like it might swallow him whole. The bills lay flat on the table, mocking him with their neat columns, a monument to greed disguised as celebration. He saw the mansion in his mind, its chandeliers glowing with money that wasn't his son's to spend. He imagined strangers clinking glasses of champagne paid for with the sweat of his overtime shifts. Years of missed weekends, nights spent at drafting tables while his boy slept down the hall. He thought of the Maui suite, white sand and blue waves, his son and Victoria, posing for photos, posting captions about blessings while he, the man who had built their foundation, sat alone in a modest Lexington kitchen. His chest tightened again, but this time it wasn't grief. It was the unmistakable sting of humiliation. Banned from the ceremony, erased from the photographs, yet summoned to foot the bill, as though his money were cleaner, more valuable than his presence. He thought of the phrase his son had written, "Be grateful I let you contribute." The arrogance in those words burned hotter than any insult he had ever endured. His knuckles whitened as he crumpled the paper in his fist, the crackle echoing like fire, only to smooth it out again with slow, deliberate hands. Anger, he realized, would do him no good if it raged uncontrolled. He needed something sharper, colder. His eyes moved to the pocket watch on the shelf, the one passed down from his father, a reminder of work, sacrifice, endurance. Its steady tick filled the silence, grounding him. He wasn't a victim. He wasn't a man to be dismissed. Stephen pushed back from the table, pacing the narrow kitchen with the bills clutched in his hand. The floorboards groaned under his weight, the same boards Kevin had raced across as a boy. Each creak whispered of dinners, shared laughter once loud in these walls, holidays that had meant something. Now those sounds were ghosts replaced by the sterile arithmetic of $80,000. He paused at the window, the October afternoon dimming into early dusk. Leaves scurried across the yard like fragments of a life he no longer recognized. The heartbreak threatened to crush him, but within it something else stirred. Betrayal had a strange way of clarifying the world. The disbelief gave way to vision, a raw understanding of what stood before him. His son had turned him into a sponsor, a silent investor in a show built for strangers, but Stephen still held the one thing they couldn't fabricate: control. Without his money, the fantasy collapsed. He returned to the table, the papers spread out once more, each number like a scar carved into his trust. His hand hovered over the photograph of his son, but he pulled back before touching it, as if the glass might burn. He studied the boy in that picture, the boy who once whispered, "You're the strongest," during a thunderstorm, when he climbed into his father's lap. The memory twisted, bittersweet and jagged. That boy was gone. In his place stood a man who valued image over blood, wealth over love. Stephen sat down again, leaning forward, elbows on the table, staring at the bills until the numbers blurred. The disbelief had done its damage. The heartbreak had hollowed him, but both left behind a void that demanded to be filled. He thought of Elena's smile, the way she had believed in him, even at his lowest. He thought of every overtime shift, every sacrifice, every promise he had kept when no one was watching. He thought of dignity. A bitter smile crept across his face, faint but steady. If Kevin thought his father's role was to quietly bankroll his extravagance, he was mistaken. This wasn't about $80,000. This was about something far more priceless. The bond of a father and son had been sold off, and Stephen wasn't about to buy it back with cash. He straightened in his chair, folded the bills with precise care, and set them aside like evidence waiting to be used. The room felt different now. Still quiet, still heavy with the weight of betrayal, but no longer suffocating. Stephen had clarity, and with clarity came resolve. He knew the path ahead wouldn't be easy, but dignity had its own kind of strength. He picked up the pocket watch again, feeling its weight in his palm, hearing its steady tick. The sound was a promise not of reconciliation, but of reckoning. He looked at the stack of bills one last time, his lips tightening. His son believed he could banish his father and still profit from him. That arrogance was about to be tested. Stephen leaned back, his eyes narrowing the storm outside, beginning to mirror the one forming within. And as the night deepened, one thought anchored him more than any other: this was only the beginning. Stephen's eyes drifted to the photo frame propped on the shelf above the table, the one that had gathered a faint veil of dust no cloth could truly erase. Inside, frozen in sun-bleached color, his son stood grinning, a boy of 8 in an oversized baseball uniform, cap tilted too far back, glove dangling loose in his small hand. That boy's eyes were wide with trust, shining with the kind of belief that only children give freely, untested and absolute. Stephen let his gaze linger, the paper bills on the table a cruel contrast to the photograph. The $80,000 demand screamed betrayal, but the picture whispered of something long gone, something once pure. He remembered the field that day. Jacobson Park, late afternoon, the grass damp from the morning's rain. He had crouched behind Kevin, guiding his arms as he gripped the bat. The boy had squinted, tongue poking out in fierce concentration. The crack of the ball, the stumble of little legs running toward first base, and the triumphant glance over his shoulder to make sure his father had seen it all returned in vivid flashes. Stephen had cheered until his throat ached, the pride swelling inside him like sunlight breaking through clouds. He could almost smell the concession stand's popcorn and hear the faint hum of cicadas in the trees beyond the diamond. That boy had believed his father was the strongest man alive. Rain. Another memory unspooled, this one softer, dimly lit by gray skies. Kevin had been maybe 7, maybe 8, small enough to still climb into his father's lap. A thunderstorm had rolled over the county sheets of water, drumming against the car roof as they sat waiting for it to pass. Lightning had split the sky, thunder chasing close behind, and Kevin had buried his face against his father's chest. "Don't worry, Dad," he'd said with muffled certainty. "You're the strongest." Stephen had wrapped his arms around the boy, holding him steady as the storm raged outside. In that cramped car, with the smell of wet earth and the fogged windows cloaking them in their own world, he had felt the fierce responsibility of fatherhood more clearly than ever. The memories came like tides, pulling him back to Elena, her presence still lingering in the corners of his mind. She had been there at those games, her laughter ringing out from the stands, her hands clapping in rhythm with every cheer. She had been there that stormy night, too, smiling in the rearview mirror as she watched her husband hold their son close. She had been the heartbeat of their little family, stitching together joy from scraps of long hours and modest paychecks. When the cancer came, Stephen had promised her he would keep Kevin steady, would carry him through the grief. He had promised to be both parents in her absence. But promises were fragile things when resentment poisoned them. He remembered the night years later when Kevin, now a grown man, accused him of not doing enough, of failing Elena, of failing them both. Stephen had stood there, phone pressed to his ear, listening as his son's voice dripped with bitterness. If you'd made more money, maybe her treatments would have worked. He'd swallowed the words then, unable to defend himself against grief sharpened into blame. He'd thought time would soften the anger, that Kevin would see the truth of sacrifices hidden beneath modest paychecks and second mortgages. But time had only hardened him. Now, staring at the photo, Stephen felt the clash of then and now with a force that hollowed him. The boy in the picture was gone, replaced by a man who treated his father as a wallet to be tapped in embarrassment, to be hidden from guests. The sorrow of that loss pressed heavier than the bills themselves. It was the kind of ache that spread quietly, seeping into his bones, reminding him that even love once unconditional could sour into something unrecognizable. His hand hovered above the frame fingertips, grazing the glass. He wanted to feel the warmth of that child again, the weight of his trust. Instead, the cool surface reminded him of distance of years piled high with unspoken words and unmet expectations. He closed his eyes, let the sound of laughter echo from a past that now felt like someone else's life. Nostalgia pressed close, but its sweetness was soured by the knowledge of where they had landed. He thought of the Christmas when Kevin was 10, tearing open a glove Stephen had worked overtime to buy. The boy had hugged him so tightly, murmuring, "Thank you, Dad," into his chest. That same boy now sent him invoices with the word grateful twisted into a weapon. He thought of the time Elena had caught Kevin on his father's shoulders, laughing as they decorated the top of the tree together. She had snapped a photo, framed it, and told Stephen, "One day, he'll know what you've carried for him." That frame was tucked away in the attic, now collecting dust alongside 1,000 moments that had meant everything then and meant nothing now. The sorrow dug deep, but beneath it lay a sharper truth. Their bond had not just weakened, it had been severed deliberately, arrogantly. Kevin had chosen image over love, Victoria's whispers over his father's presence, status over family. And for Stephen, there was no going back to Little League games or rainy afternoons. There was no reclaiming the innocence of that trust, but there was still dignity. His eyes hardened as he set the frame back on the shelf, the photo tilted slightly in its stand. He turned back to the papers spread across the table, the demand scrawled at the bottom, the insult carved into every line item. He had carried his son through childhood storms, through grief, through the shadows of losing Elena. And this was the thanks. An $80,000 bill delivered like an execution notice. The nostalgia ebbed, leaving in its wake a steel-edged clarity. Love had been the foundation once, but when love was betrayed, something else had to rise in its place. He traced a finger across the paper, not with grief this time, but with resolve. The sorrow still ached, but it no longer paralyzed him. It sharpened him. The photo of Kevin as a boy lingered in his mind, a reminder not of what was lost, but of what could never be reclaimed. That innocence was gone forever. What remained now was a different kind of promise, one not made to Elena or to the boy Kevin used to be, but to himself. He would not be used. He would not be humiliated. He would not let betrayal go unanswered. As the room grew darker, the shadows lengthening across the worn table, Stephen leaned back in his chair, eyes fixed on the faint reflection of the photo in the window pane. Outside, the wind stirred the branches, scattering leaves across the yard. Inside, a storm brewed with equal force. And as the pocket watch ticked steadily beside him, its sound cutting through the silence, Stephen realized the memories had served their purpose. They reminded him of what once was, of what had been lost, and of why he could never allow this insult to stand. The ache of nostalgia gave way to a colder fire, a promise he was finally ready to keep. The bills still waited, their numbers glaring, their arrogance undeniable. And Stephen, with the echoes of better days fading into the quiet of his kitchen, prepared to show his son exactly what it meant to underestimate him. This was no longer about the past. This was about what came next. The words replayed in Stephen's mind with a venom that time had not diluted. If you'd made more money, maybe her treatments would have worked. His son's voice, laced with bitterness, had cut deeper than the cancer itself, deeper than the cold reality of hospital bills and nights spent praying in the glow of fluorescent lights. He had heard it years ago, standing alone in his kitchen after Elena's funeral, his phone pressed against his ear as Kevin's accusations poured down on him like acid. He had swallowed the guilt then, too exhausted to defend himself, too broken to explain how he had mortgaged the house sold. The car worked overtime shifts that left his hands trembling from fatigue just to give her a fighting chance. None of it had been enough. Not for Elena, not for Kevin. Now, staring at the crumpled invoice on the table, the weight of that accusation pressed against his ribs once again. The guilt was still there, raw as ever, but it had changed shape. It was no longer the kind that kept him awake at night or forced him to replay every decision he had made. It had hardened into something sharper, colder. The grief that once hollowed him now filled with steel. He moved to the sink, ran cold water over his face, the October air leaking through the window screen and chilling his skin. He remembered Elena's last night, her fragile hand clutching his with a strength that belied her frailty. She had whispered, "Take care of him, Stephen. Promise me." He had nodded, choking on the promise even as it lodged itself deep in his chest. He had done everything to honor it, but promises had limits. Promises could not survive a son who weaponized grief into cruelty, who measured his father's worth in dollar signs and status symbols. The grief shifted inside him, curling into something unrecognizable. His chest no longer ached with helplessness, but with a pressure that demanded release. His son had expected him to bow, to pay the bill, to accept humiliation in silence. But Stephen was not a man built to kneel. He had built a life from stubborn grit, from blueprints and hard hats, from long nights with calloused hands. If Kevin thought age and sorrow had weakened him, he was gravely mistaken. He returned to the table, his gaze falling again on the old pocket watch. It ticked steadily, a reminder of the men who had come before him. His father, his grandfather, men who had endured their own storms without flinching. Stephen's reflection warped in the glass face of the watch, lines of age, etched deep eyes, shadowed by years of loss, but behind them a glimmer of something unyielding. That spark had been buried under grief, under Kevin's contempt, but now it flickered to life. His mind turned over the pieces. The wedding, the vendors, the mansion rental, the honeymoon suite, all of it perched precariously on the foundation of his supposed contribution. One refusal, one pull of support, and the entire structure collapsed. He could already hear the panic in Kevin's voice, the frantic justifications Victoria would spin. Without his signature on the check, their empire of chandeliers and champagne would crumble into dust. He poured himself a glass of cheap red wine, the bitterness sharp on his tongue, sharpening his thoughts. He would not rage blindly. Rage was what Kevin expected, a fit of anger easily dismissed as the tantrum of an old man. No, Stephen would do what he had always done best, build carefully, dismantle, quietly engineer every detail until the collapse looked inevitable. His son would never see it coming until the foundation gave way beneath his feet. The house creaked around him as the wind picked up outside, a storm threatening on the horizon. It felt fitting, as though the world itself mirrored the storm taking root in his chest. He opened his laptop, the screen humming to life in the dim kitchen. His hands moved with deliberate purpose, searching, scrolling, piecing together names, dates, vendors, every fragile link in Kevin and Victoria's perfect facade. Each discovery fed the spark inside him, turning grief into fire into resolve. The bitterness that had once eaten at him now felt like fuel. Every insult, every dismissal, every time Kevin had brushed him aside as if his sacrifices were worthless, each one layered into the foundation of something new. Justice. Not revenge born of blind fury, but justice carved from patience, from experience, from the quiet knowledge that he had been underestimated for far too long. He closed his eyes for a moment, letting the memories of Elena settle around him. He pictured her smile, the way she used to rest her hand on his shoulder when the weight of the world pressed too hard. He imagined what she might say now, seeing the way Kevin had twisted everything she had loved into entitlement. She would tell him to stand tall. She would tell him to remind their son of the values they had once tried to instill. She would tell him not to break beneath the cruelty. When his eyes opened again, the sorrow was still there, but it no longer drowned him. It sharpened his focus. The bills lay on the table like evidence in a case, and Stephen felt as though he were both the judge and the executioner. He would not pay. He would not beg. He would not allow Kevin's arrogance to go unanswered. The hum of the refrigerator filled the silence as he sat back, wineglass in hand, staring at the photograph of Kevin as a child. That boy was gone, consumed by ambition and contempt. But the man who had raised him remained, and he was no longer willing to bend. The grief had been his prison, but grief had forged him into something harder than his son could ever understand. The plan was already forming, each step as precise as the blueprints he once drafted. He would dismantle Kevin's fantasy piece by piece, thread by thread, until the boy who once called him the strongest learned exactly what strength meant. The storm outside rattled the windows, leaves scraping across the porch like restless whispers. Stephen set down his glass, the decision solid in his chest. He no longer felt like a man cornered. He felt like a man stepping onto the battlefield with every intention of winning. And as the night deepened, the air thick with the promise of rain, he realized he was no longer haunted by Elena's last request. He was honoring it in the only way left to him, by showing their son that dignity was not for sale. The bitterness had done its work. The grief had hardened into steel. And now the plan was ready to take shape. What he did next would determine everything. Stephen sat in the dim kitchen, the blue glow of his old laptop flickering across his lined face. The house was silent, except for the rhythmic tick of the pocket watch on the table and the faint hiss of the autumn wind against the window. He typed slowly, deliberately, each keystroke a drumbeat of purpose. He had no interest in reliving the humiliation of the bill, but something inside him told him there was more to uncover. Kevin had always hidden behind walls of pride, but Victoria. She craved the spotlight. And sure enough, with a few clicks, the facade began to peel away. Her social media account opened without resistance, a public stage built for admiration. The first photo filled the screen, Victoria draped in a designer gown, standing in the foyer of a sprawling estate lit with chandeliers. The caption sparkled with smugness. "Can't wait for our dream wedding at the Ashford estate. #blessed, #luxury living." His eyes narrowed. This was the mansion rental he had been billed $50,000 for, paraded online as if it were the fruit of their hard work. He scrolled further, each swipe a tightening of the knot in his chest. A photo of the caterer's glossy spread, lobster tails gleaming under studio lights, crystal glasses reflecting gold light. The caption mocked him with its carelessness. "Only the best for our guests. Farm-to-table elegance." He thought of the $20,000 figure printed on the bill, each dollar representing hours he had spent on construction sites long after his co-workers had gone home. He thought of Elena cooking meals from scratch in their modest kitchen, stretching every penny while this woman boasted about champagne towers on a platform meant for strangers to gawk. Then he saw at the post that cut deeper than all the rest. A shot of Victoria in a boutique veil pinned to her hair, Kevin at her side, grinning like he had won a prize. The caption bubbled with cruelty disguised as wit. "Daddy's paying for the party." Indirectly. A wink emoji trailed at the end, a dagger twisted just enough to let the wound bleed. Stephen's jaw tightened, his hand curling into a fist against the table. The word "daddy" cheapened into a punchline stripped him of dignity in front of strangers who would never know the truth. They saw a man funding extravagance, not the father who had sold his car to pay hospital bills, who had worked himself to the bone to give his son a chance at a life beyond scarcity. The humiliation burned hot, but the heat didn't consume him this time. It refined him, tempered him into something steadier. He leaned back in his chair, breathing through the rage until the edges of his vision cleared. Anger alone was reckless. Anger needed focus. He studied the photos again this time, not with hurt, but with calculation. Every caption was evidence, every detail a weakness. He jotted notes onto a pad by the keyboard. Venue, Ashford Estate, $50K. Caterer, Elite Events, $20K. Photographer, Leah Voss. Planner, Mark Brennan. Each name was a thread, each thread a part of the tapestry Kevin and Victoria were weaving, and tapestries he knew unraveled when a single thread was pulled with precision. The smugness in Victoria's posts revealed more than she intended. Dates vendors, even contracts hinted at in hashtags. Stephen could see their pride in every carefully curated shot, but he could also see the fragility beneath it. They were building a castle on sand, counting on him to play the role of silent financier. Without him, without his money, the cracks would spread fast. He sipped from the glass of wine beside him, its bitter tang grounding him. He no longer felt the hollow ache of betrayal. He felt something far colder, something Elena would have recognized in his eyes whenever he set his jaw before taking on a job no one else wanted. It was resolve. Strategic, patient, merciless resolve. Scrolling deeper, he found a video of Victoria laughing with friends as they sampled wine at a vineyard, Kevin in the background raising his glass. The caption read, "A toast to our future on Dad's tab." He paused the video, staring at the frozen frame of his son's smirk, a look so foreign, so drenched in entitlement, it barely resembled the boy he had once held through thunderstorms. That smirk became fuel. He could hear Elena's voice in his memory, soft but firm. Don't let him forget where he came from. Stephen closed the laptop with a quiet click, the sound final in the dark kitchen. The humiliation still burned, but it no longer weakened him. It sharpened him. They had mocked him in public, turned his role as father into a punchline, treated his sacrifices as background noise to their performance. They thought they had stripped him of power, but in reality they had given him everything he needed. Proof of their arrogance, proof of their dependence, proof that without him, their perfect day would collapse under the weight of its own vanity. He reached for the pocket watch, its chain coiling cool and heavy in his hand. The ticking was steady, unbroken, a reminder that time was on his side. He didn't need to shout. He didn't need to confront. He needed only to wait, to plan, to pull the right thread at the right moment. Their pride would do the rest of the work. The storm outside had gathered strength, rain beginning to patter against the windows in rhythmic bursts. Stephen sat motionless, listening to the sound, his reflection faint in the glass. He thought of Kevin's laughter in the video, the careless arrogance of a man who had forgotten his roots, who had forgotten the hands that had lifted him to where he stood. The sorrow was still there, a dull echo in his chest, but it no longer controlled him. He set the watch down, its ticking merging with the rain. His notes lay spread across the table, a map of the empire Kevin and Victoria thought they had built, an empire that now had a countdown etched into its foundation. Stephen stood, stretched his stiff shoulders, and let out a slow breath. He had seen enough. The path ahead was clear. Every vendor, every contract, every fragile detail was now in his hands. And as he turned off the light, leaving the kitchen in darkness except for the glow of the storm, one thought lingered sharp and steady. The next move would not be his son's to make. The next morning broke gray and sharp, the kind of day where the air tasted metallic and every gust of wind carried a warning. Stephen rose before the sun, his body moving with a quiet precision that belied the storm inside him. He showered, shaved, pulled on a clean sweater, and pressed slacks, clothes simple but serious. He poured coffee into a battered thermos, the bitter aroma filling the kitchen as he gathered the folded bill and his notes. The pocket watch slipped into his pocket, its steady weight against his chest like armor. By the time he locked the front door, the resolve had already settled in his bones. Traffic was light as he drove through Lexington, autumn leaves tumbling across the hood of his car like confetti stripped of celebration. He gripped the wheel with steady hands, every red light a chance to replay. Victoria's smirk, Kevin's careless grin, the words, "Be grateful I let you contribute," burned into his memory. At one light he hesitated, foot hovering over the gas, a flicker of doubt threatening to rise. Was this the point of no return? He pushed the thought aside. Justice wasn't about hesitation. It was about showing the truth. Mark Brennan's office stood like a monument to sleek ambition, a tower of glass and chrome that reflected the morning sky. Stephen parked in the visitor's lot, the pavement slick with dew, and walked toward the revolving doors. Inside, the lobby smelled faintly of polished wood and expensive cologne. Every detail screamed wealth, curated perfection, the kind of world Kevin was desperate to be accepted into. The receptionist greeted him with a practiced smile, her eyes flicking to the file in his hand before directing him upstairs. Mark himself met him with a handshake that was firm but distracted his tailored suit, whispering wealth with every crease. His office looked like a showroom for power-framed photos of smiling couples beneath gazebo stacks of swatches and contracts arranged in perfect order, the faint hum of a sound system playing classical music. Stephen took it all in as he settled into the chair across the desk, the bills heavy in his hand. So Mark began pulling out a folder. The 80,000 covers everything: venue, catering, even the honeymoon deposit. Kevin assured me it's all arranged. Stephen leaned forward, his voice even but sharp. Did he tell you he banned me from the wedding? The words dropped into the room like a stone into still water. Mark blinked, his polished composure faltering. The pen in his hand slipped slightly, tapping against the folder. Banned. He repeated the word, awkward in his mouth. That's right, Stephen said. I'm not invited. I'm not welcome. But I'm the one footing the bill. He slid the papers across the desk, his finger tapping on the line that bore Kevin's smug note. This was what he sent me. A demand. No invitation. Just this. Mark's eyes darted across the itemized list, the scrawl at the bottom. His lips pressed into a thin line as he rubbed his temple. Mr. Torres, I didn't know. Awkward, isn't it? Stephen cut in, his tone sharp. To hear that the man you expect payment from has been treated like a stranger. Worse than a stranger. The silence stretched heavy with tension. Mark shifted in his chair, suddenly less sure of himself, less polished. Well, the contracts are signed, he stammered. Deposits are non-refundable, but without the remaining balance. Exactly, Stephen interrupted again, his voice steady as stone. Without my payment, you can't proceed. And you won't get a cent from me until my son talks to me directly. No more notes, no more arrogance. If he wants this wedding, he'll have to face me. Mark opened his mouth, then closed it again. His shoulders sagged slightly, the mask of professionalism slipping. I understand, he said finally. This changes things. Stephen stood, tucking the papers back into his folder. Remind him how fragile plans can be, he said. Remind him that without me, this perfect day of his collapses. As he turned to leave, he heard a muttered remark, barely audible, but enough to cut through the air. That arrogant kid. The words lit something inside Stephen, not anger this time, but satisfaction. He walked out of the sleek office into the crisp morning air, the door clicking shut behind him like the punctuation at the end of a sentence. He inhaled deeply, the cool air filling his lungs, the city humming with life around him. For the first time in years he felt taller, stronger, no longer bent under grief or guilt. He had seized control, and the ripple of that decision spread outward with every step he took. Standing on the sidewalk, he glanced up at the tower of glass, its surface reflecting the clouds that gathered above. He thought of Kevin's smirk, Victoria's smug captions, the careless way they had mocked him. That arrogance would be their undoing, and he had just planted the first crack. The thought brought a slow, steady smile to his lips, the kind of smile that carried no warmth, only resolve. He slid into his car, the seat groaning beneath him, and pulled the pocket watch from his sweater. The chain glinted faintly in the light as he held it in his palm, the ticking steady, unwavering. He had been underestimated, dismissed as old, as irrelevant as a man past his prime. But now the balance had shifted. He was no longer on the defensive. He was building something, and what he built would last. As he started the engine, the hum beneath the hood matched the hum in his chest. He knew Kevin wouldn't take the blow quietly. His son's pride would not allow it. Calls would come, demands, accusations, pleas. The cracks would spread, and with them the panic. Stephen adjusted the rearview mirror, his eyes catching his own reflection. The man staring back wasn't broken anymore. He was ready. The traffic thickened as he merged onto Main Street, horns blaring, lights flashing. The world moved on as though nothing had changed, but Stephen knew better. The tide had turned, and Kevin's perfect facade was already beginning to crumble. And as he drove away from the office, the notes in his folder rustling faintly with each bump in the road, one thought rang louder than all the noise outside. The real reckoning hadn't even begun. Stephen drove through the streets of Lexington with the city unfolding around him in gray November light, his grip steady on the wheel, but his thoughts sharper than the traffic horns blaring in the distance. The meeting with Mark Brennan still echoed in his head, every detail seared into memory. The planner's shock, the falter in his polished tone, the muttered truth that Kevin was arrogant. That acknowledgement, small as it was, had filled Stephen with a rush of vindication. For years he had been painted as the problem, the obstacle, the man who wasn't enough. Now the facade was cracking, but he knew Kevin would not back down so easily. His son had pride, and pride made men reckless. He turned into his driveway, the familiar creak of the wooden boards under his tires grounding him. The house felt different when he stepped inside, less empty, more alive with the hum of something taking shape. But instinct told him he couldn't fight this battle alone. He needed an ally, someone who knew Kevin, someone who could see past the polished veneer his son and Victoria had plastered over their lives. His eyes drifted to the pocket watch on the table, its steady tick syncing with the thought forming in his mind. Alex. The name stirred memories he hadn't revisited in years. Alex had been Kevin's closest friend, growing up practically another son in the house after his parents' messy divorce. Stephen remembered Elena making hot chocolate for them, the two boys sprawled on the living room rug with comic books, their laughter echoing through the house. Kevin had drifted away as ambition hardened him, leaving Alex behind without a backward glance. But Stephen had kept the number saved in an old contact list, untouched like a relic. He picked up his phone thumb, hovering over the digits. Hesitation catching him for a breath before resolve pressed him forward. The line rang twice before a voice answered, deeper now, but still carrying the warmth of recognition. Mr. T. Wow. It's been years, Stephen, he corrected softly. Call me Stephen now. It's been too long, Alex. How are you holding up? There was a pause, then a dry chuckle. I hear you've got a situation with Kevin. Word travels. I'm a detective these days, private work photography on the side. Let's just say I hear things. Stephen felt the knot in his chest loosen slightly. Then you know why I'm calling. He banned me from his wedding, sent me a bill for $80,000. I'm not paying, I'm fighting back. But I need help. Alex's tone hardened, a quiet edge beneath the familiarity. That sounds exactly like him. He ditched me years ago when I wouldn't fake a reference for one of his jobs. Said I was holding him back. I should have seen it coming. Ambition has a way of eating people alive, Stephen said. But I'm done letting it eat me. Meet me at the cafe on Broadway, Alex replied without hesitation. An hour. We'll talk. The cafe smelled of fresh-baked scones and roasted coffee, the air warm against the chill of late autumn outside. Stephen sat at a corner table, the window framing falling leaves as he waited. When Alex walked in, taller than he remembered, and carrying the weight of experience in his steady eyes, Stephen felt something he hadn't in a long time: relief. They shook hands firmly. No words needed for the years between them. "You look good," Alex said, sliding into the seat across from him. "Older, sure, but solid. Sorry about Elena. She was like a mom to me, too." Stephen nodded, swallowing the sting of her name. She would have wanted me to fight for what's right. They ordered coffee, the steam curling between them like the rekindling of trust. Stephen laid out the story, every detail from the bill to Victoria's smug captions online. Alex listened without interruption, his detective's mind already ticking behind his calm expression. When Stephen finished, Alex leaned forward, his voice low but resolute. "Kevin hasn't changed. In college, he borrowed my project ideas, passed them off as his own. When I called him out, he ghosted me. He's always used people. And Victoria, from what I've seen, she's worse. All about appearances, all about image." Stephen felt a surge of vindication, not just from Alex's words, but from the weight behind them. This wasn't just his grief speaking anymore. Someone else saw it too. Someone else had suffered the same betrayal. "So what do we do?" Stephen asked. "We gather evidence," Alex replied. "We document everything. The vendors, the payments, the whispers. If they slip, we'll have proof. Photos, recordings, witness accounts. We can build leverage. You don't need to shout, Stephen. You just need to show the truth when the time comes." Stephen leaned back, a faint smile tugging at his lips. It wasn't joy, not yet, but the first glimmer of hope he had felt in years. "You'd do that for me?" Alex's eyes softened. "You did plenty for me back then. After my folks split, you let me crash at your place. You tutored me when no one else bothered. I owe you. And besides, this isn't just about you. It's about finally holding him accountable." They spent hours sketching out a plan, coffee cups refilled until the table was crowded with empty mugs. Alex outlined how he could use his camera to capture the cracks in Kevin and Victoria's perfect facade, how he could slip into spaces unseen, listening, watching. Stephen added details from his notes, every vendor, every timeline, every caption that betrayed their arrogance. Together the plan began to take shape, not revenge for revenge's sake, but a strategy built on patience and precision. When they finally stood to leave, the cafe had grown quiet, only a few stragglers lingering with laptops and empty cups. They shook hands again, firmer this time, the weight of alliance pressing into their palms. "Tonight," Alex said, slinging his camera bag over his shoulder, "I'll bring the gear. We'll set up what you need. Recordings, cameras, logs. If Kevin tries to twist this, we'll be ready." Stephen nodded, the tension in his chest replaced by something steadier. Justice, not revenge. Justice, Alex agreed. As Stephen walked back to his car, the crisp air biting his cheeks, he felt lighter, though the burden of betrayal still clung to him. He wasn't alone anymore. For the first time since Elena's passing, he felt the strength of loyalty at his side, not fleeting, not conditional, but earned and restored. The pocket watch ticked in his pocket as he started the engine, its rhythm in sync with the steady pulse of determination. He drove through the rain-slicked streets with headlights cutting through the dark, his mind sharp, his path clear. And as he turned onto his street, the house waiting like a quiet fortress in the distance, one thought kept circling through his mind, steady and unshakable. Kevin believed he held all the power, but he had no idea the storm that was about to break. The first voicemail came late in the evening, the phone buzzing across Stephen's kitchen table as the kettle whistled in the background. He let it ring, let the sound echo against the faded walls before it fell into silence. Moments later, the alert blinked. A message. He poured hot water over the waiting tea bag, the steam curling into the dim light, and pressed play. Kevin's voice, taut but trying for composure, filled the room. "Dad, there's been a misunderstanding. The planner called, said you pulled out. We need to sort this. Call me." The words carried that old entitlement, but underneath Stephen heard at the edge of panic. He replayed it once, twice, savoring the cracks in his son's control. Another message followed within the hour, this time from Victoria. Her tone was clipped sharp, the sound of a woman used to being obeyed. "Stephen, the vendors are threatening to cancel without your contribution. Don't do this. It's petty." The word hung in the air like a slap, but he only smiled faintly into his cup of chamomile. Petty. That was the mask arrogance wore when fear began to creep in. He sipped slowly, letting the warmth settle in his chest, not rushing, not reacting. By midnight, 3 more messages waited. Kevin again, his voice cracking under the weight of pressure. "Dad, seriously, pick up. Everything's falling apart. You owe us this after everything." There was the old jab, the twisted guilt from years ago, but even that rang hollow now. Stephen listened twice, noting how desperation bled into every syllable. The power had shifted, and Kevin knew it. The next morning, neighbors carried the whispers before the paperboy even made his rounds. Mrs. Hargrove from 2 houses down called, her voice hesitant but tinged with curiosity. "Stephen, I've heard things about Kevin's wedding, trouble with the money. People are talking at the club. Hope you're all right." He thanked her politely, but when he hung up, the corners of his mouth curved into something he hadn't felt in years. Vindication. For so long he had been painted as the failure, the father who hadn't done enough, the man who was never enough. Now the story twisted in the wind, and Kevin's carefully curated image began to fray. Later, Mr. Ellis from across the fence leaned over while raking leaves, his voice gruff but supportive. "Saw Kevin yelling at a delivery guy yesterday. Rude as hell, shouting about discounts like he owned the place. Victoria just stood there. Folks are noticing, Stephen. They're not impressed." The old man chuckled dryly, shaking his head. "Pride comes before the fall." Stephen nodded, the rake scratching leaves into piles behind him. He said nothing, but inside the satisfaction thrummed steady. Each day brought more calls, more messages. Vendors pulling out deposits, threatened contracts dangling by threads. The house filled with their voices, even when he refused to answer the phone, vibrating on the table like a trapped insect. He let them pile up, each plea another stone on the growing monument of their arrogance collapsing in on itself. He listened at night, sometimes more than once, not with cruelty but with the quiet calm of a man who had finally reclaimed the ground beneath his feet. Still, the satisfaction was laced with sorrow. This was his son, the boy he had carried through storms, the boy who once whispered, "You're the strongest," into his chest. To hear that same voice, now brittle with panic, clawing for money instead of reaching for trust, cut deeper than he cared to admit. He felt the sadness like a bruise beneath the armor of his resolve. A father's love did not vanish. It calcified into something harder, heavier, tinged with grief. At night he walked the quiet streets, the cold air biting his cheeks, the crunch of leaves underfoot, steady as the pocket watch ticking in his coat. Neighbors nodded. Some offered sympathetic smiles. Others lowered their voices in hushed curiosity. He became both witness and judge to the unraveling, standing silent, as the perfect wedding crumbled before it ever began. By the 3rd day, the tone of the messages had shifted completely. Kevin no longer sounded arrogant. His words came rushed, frantic, the sound of a man cornered. "Dad, please, they're threatening to shut it down. The estate, the caterers, everyone's pulling back. You can fix this. Guests are asking questions. Please." Stephen let the message finish, then pressed replay, closing his eyes as he listened again. The desperation was undeniable, the power reversed. Yet the weight of it pressed on him too. The vindication carried a cost, and that cost was blood. He had wanted justice, not the hollow echo of a family feud carried into the streets. Neighbors whispered, vendors gossiped, the ripples spreading wider with every unanswered call. His name and Kevin's tangled in conversations at cafes and murmurs outside grocery stores in the quiet judgment of a community watching spectacle replace celebration. Still he did not waver. His resolve held steady because this was the lesson his son had forced him to teach. Respect could not be bought, love could not be demanded, and dignity was not a check to be written and forgotten. The phone buzzed again, another voicemail stacking on the pile, another thread unraveling from Kevin's carefully woven image. Stephen sat at the kitchen table, the dim light pooling over the spread of notes and the folded bill. The pocket watch ticked beside them, steady as ever. He pressed play on the latest message, listened to Kevin's breathless voice, Victoria's clipped tones in the background, their panic painting the air with cracks. His lips tightened not in anger but in quiet satisfaction. The storm they had built was finally circling back to them. And as the rain began to fall outside, streaking the window with silver lines, Stephen leaned back in his chair, the hum of control steady in his chest. The feud had spilled into the open now, whispers echoing beyond their walls, desperation spilling through every message. He had the power, and they knew it. But as he set the phone down, the silence closing in once more, he understood something deeper. The storm was far from over. The real collapse was still to come, and when it did, it would leave nothing standing but the truth. Dawn broke heavy with rain, a steady drum of water against the windows, as Stephen sat in his kitchen, the pocket watch ticking in rhythm with the storm. The day had arrived, November 15th, the one Kevin and Victoria had paraded across social media, the one they had promised would be flawless. Instead, the weather mirrored what Stephen had set in motion, a deluge tearing through their carefully constructed fantasy. His phone buzzed early with a message from Alex, photos of florists packing up arrangements, their faces sour as they loaded vans into the rain. The caption beneath read simply, "Deposit issues. They're leaving." Stephen sipped his coffee, the bitterness sharp but satisfying. More images arrived, each one like a nail driven deeper into the coffin of their grand spectacle. Caterers idled in trucks, crates of untouched china being hauled back into vans. Workers folded tents that had barely been erected, the rain streaking down their shoulders in thin, angry lines. Guests began to arrive, umbrellas blooming in the gray drizzle, confusion etched on their faces as they wandered a half-dressed estate. Whispers carried through Alex's recordings. "Where's the setup? What happened to the band?" It was chaos dressed in formal wear, and Stephen watched it unfold in real time, his kitchen transformed into a war room. By noon, the calls started again. Kevin's number flashing, then Victoria's, the vibrations skittering the phone across the table. He let them pile up one after another until curiosity pulled him to press play. Kevin's voice was frantic, no trace of the composure he once wielded like a weapon. "Dad, send the money now. Everything's falling apart. The estate manager is threatening to shut us down. Please." The desperation cracked through raw and unfiltered, and Stephen replayed it once more, not to gloat, but to feel the shift. His son, who had written, "Be grateful I let you contribute," was now begging. Alex's update streamed in. The grand hall was half-dressed chairs scattered like abandoned chess pieces. The string quartet had vanished, refusing to play without payment. Guests huddled in corners, murmuring about poor planning, their laughter edged with ridicule. Then came the photo that cut deeper than the rest, Victoria in her gown, makeup streaked by rain, her face twisted in despair as the storm blurred the windows behind her. For a moment, Stephen felt the pang of sorrow, not for her, but for the ruin of what should have been joy. He had not wanted to destroy love, only to teach his son that dignity could not be bought or mocked. But sorrow gave way to the reminder of the bill, the arrogance, the years of being cast aside. Justice was rarely gentle, and this was no exception. By late afternoon, Alex reported guests leaving, some slipping away under umbrellas, others muttering about wasted time and ruined reputations. The ripple had become a wave, Kevin's perfect image shredded before the very people he had tried so hard to impress. Then came the pounding at the door, heavy and insistent against the storm. Stephen rose slowly, his knees stiff but his steps steady, and peered through the peephole. Kevin and Victoria stood there, soaked and shivering, coats clinging to them, faces pale with humiliation. He opened the door a crack, the cold mist spilling in as Kevin pushed forward, water dripping onto the rug. "Dad, let us in. The wedding's ruined. Vendors left, guests scattered. It's a disaster." His voice broke, his bravado gone, replaced with the pleading of a child. Victoria huddled behind him, her gown peeking absurdly from beneath her coat. Mascara streaked down her cheeks. Stephen stepped aside, watching them drip in the hallway, their desperation filling the air like a sour perfume. Kevin ran a trembling hand through his wet hair, his voice catching. It was a mistake. Victoria's idea, the image, the pressure. But now everything's collapsed. Help us, Dad, for old time's sake. Stephen folded his arms, his eyes steady. Old times. Like when you blamed me for your mother's death. Like when you sent me a bill instead of an invitation. His voice was calm, almost soft, but each word struck like steel. Victoria's voice cracked for the first time, wavering. "We didn't mean it's just the stress. The honeymoon's booked, deposits lost. Please think of us. Think of you." Stephen echoed, his tone sharp but controlled. "When did you last think of me without reaching for my wallet?" Kevin hesitated, eyes darting, then forced the words out. "Of course your family. But success means standards. Please just transfer it." There it was again, the truth hidden inside the plea: standards over bonds, image over blood. Stephen's chest tightened, sorrow pressing against his ribs, but he did not waver. "No, Kevin. This is the consequence. Greed has a price." Kevin's face twisted, his voice rising in panic. "You're destroying us. Guests are whispering, vendors are mocking. Fix it for your son." Stephen shook his head slowly, his voice low but unyielding. "Go learn from this." He moved to open the door, rain roaring louder outside, the storm pressing against the house like judgment itself. Kevin's final words tumbled out raw and unpolished. "Wait, Dad. I regret it. All of it." The words lingered in the air, fragile and broken, but Stephen closed the door on them, their footsteps fading into the storm as the rain swallowed their voices. He stood in the hallway, heart heavy but steady, the silence that followed filled with both relief and grief. Justice had been served, but it carried no joy, only the bittersweet weight of love twisted beyond recognition. That night, he sat in his armchair by the window, rain streaking the glass in fading patterns. Their car lights cut through the dusk once before vanishing into the distance, leaving the house wrapped in a hush that felt almost comforting. Days blurred after that, neighbors calling with curiosity, whispers circling about the collapse of Kevin's wedding. Stephen listened, answered politely, but never revealed more than what was needed. One evening he placed the folded bill into the fireplace, the flames consuming it slowly, the ashes curling upward like ghosts released. He lifted a mug of coffee in quiet toast, not to victory, but to dignity, reclaimed. Alex's message came days later, confirming what Stephen already knew. The collapse had spread wide. Reputations shattered, vendors pulling away for good. Stephen leaned back, the pocket watch ticking steady beside him, and let the quiet wash over him. The storm had passed, the reckoning complete. His son's regret echoed, still a seed planted in the wreckage. Whether it grew into something stronger, Stephen could not say. But as the clouds broke and sunlight filtered through at last, he felt lighter, unburdened, ready to face whatever came next. The lesson had been written in rain, in whispers, in silence. And the story was not over yet. The rain tapered into silence that night, leaving the world outside, cloaked in damp shadows, and the quiet hum of a storm spent. Stephen stood in the hallway, his hand still resting on the door he had closed with finality. Beyond it, Kevin's desperate words lingered in the air, but inside the house held only the calm of a man who had reclaimed something long stolen from him. His chest rose slowly, each breath measured, as if his very lungs were relearning what it felt like to draw air without the weight of shame pressing down. For the first time in years, he felt taller. He walked back into the living room, the floorboards creaking beneath his steps like old companions witnessing the moment. The fireplace waited cold and empty, its grate filled with ash from forgotten winters. On the table lay the bill, folded with surgical precision, its figures and insults burned into his mind. $80,000 of arrogance. Be grateful I let you contribute. He picked it up one last time, holding it under the lamplight, reading the words, not with rage, but with clarity. It was more than paper. It was the symbol of every slight, every dismissal, every time he had been treated as expendable by the son he had raised alone. He struck a match, the flame small but eager, and touched it to the corner. The paper curled instantly, edges blackening as the fire spread across the neat rows of numbers. He dropped it into the fireplace, watching the flames consume it, hungrily devouring the arrogance line by line. The ink melted into smoke, the bill reduced to fragile curls of ash. He leaned back in his chair, eyes fixed on the blaze, his face lit by its glow. The fire didn't roar. It whispered quiet and steady, like justice itself. Beside him, a mug of coffee waited, the steam rising in delicate ribbons. He lifted it slowly, the ceramic warm in his hand, and raised it in a silent toast. Not to victory, not to revenge, but to freedom. The sip was bitter, grounding, familiar. He swallowed and let it sit heavy in his chest, a seal on the choice he had made. The phone buzzed again on the table, another call he would not answer. He let it ring until the sound faded into the shadows. Kevin's regret. Kevin's pleading. It was not his burden to carry anymore. He had done his part as a father. He had sacrificed, he had endured, and he had borne the weight of blame that was never his to begin with. That chapter was closed, sealed in ash and smoke. The pocket watch ticked on the mantel, steady as ever, each beat a reminder of time's indifference and endurance. Stephen reached for it, feeling the familiar weight in his palm, and smiled faintly. His father had passed it down a chain of resilience unbroken by hardship. Now it ticked not as a reminder of duty, but as a mark of dignity restored. In the days that followed, the whispers continued. Neighbors spoke of the collapsed wedding, of guests left stranded in the rain of Victoria's tears and Kevin's fury. Stephen answered their questions with a quiet shrug, never giving more than a polite nod. It wasn't his story to spin anymore. The truth had already revealed itself, and the consequences belonged to his son. Alex stopped by one evening, camera bag slung over his shoulder, his eyes carrying both satisfaction and sympathy. "You did it," he said simply, handing over photos, empty tents, guests scattering, vendors packing their trucks. Stephen looked through them once, then set them aside. He didn't need proof of what he already knew. What mattered wasn't their humiliation. What mattered was the silence inside him where guilt had once lived. They sat by the fire, 2 mugs of coffee between them, and for a while they talked not of Kevin or Victoria, but of old times, of Elena's laughter, of summers spent at the baseball field. Alex grinned at a memory of childhood pranks, the sound of it easing the heaviness of the room. Stephen felt the edges of a smile tug at his lips, small but real. For the first time in a long time, his memories weren't shackles. They were simply memories. Later that night, after Alex left, Stephen sat alone again, the house wrapped in a hush that felt more like comfort than loneliness. He opened an old photo album, the pages worn and corners bent, images of a life once whole staring back at him. He let himself linger, not in pain, but in acceptance. Elena's smile looked out from the photographs, soft and steady, as if she too approved of the man he had become in her absence. He closed the album gently, set it aside, and leaned back into the armchair. Outside, the storm had passed, the air sharp and clean, moonlight breaking through scattered clouds. Stephen rose, opened the front door, and stepped onto the porch. The yard glistened with rain, the air filled with the scent of wet leaves and earth. He breathed it in deeply, the coolness biting but refreshing. The night stretched out before him, quiet and endless, a new chapter waiting to be written. For years he had lived beneath the weight of grief, guilt, and his son's disdain. For years he had been diminished, cast as the man who wasn't enough. But standing there beneath the silver glow of the moon, he felt none of that. He felt only the solid ground beneath his feet and the lightness in his chest. He raised his mug one last time, this time to the night sky itself, and whispered the words not to his son, not to his neighbors, not even to Elena, but to himself, to dignity. He drank the warmth spreading through him, anchoring him to the man he had always been, the man no insult or demand could erase. When he returned inside, the fire in the hearth had burned low, leaving only embers glowing faintly in the dark. He settled back into his chair, the pocket watch ticking on the mantel, the house breathing with the kind of peace he had not felt in years. And as the night deepened, his eyes closed slowly, not from exhaustion, but from ease, the kind of rest that came only when a man had nothing left to prove. The storm was over. The lesson was delivered. The ashes in the fireplace marked the end of one story and the beginning of another. The world outside slept, and so did Stephen. A man no longer haunted but free. Stephen's story is more than a tale of family betrayal. It's a reminder of the dignity every parent deserves. Too often, mothers and fathers who spent their lives sacrificing for their children are reduced to wallets taken for granted until they push back. This story shows that respect cannot be bought with money, and love cannot survive when it is only demanded, never returned. For older Americans, it speaks directly to the quiet fears of being discarded or dismissed, and the quiet strength that comes when one decides enough is enough. Reclaiming self-worth is not about revenge. It's about refusing to let anyone, even your own blood, erase your value. Stephen's choice to walk away from humiliation and stand firm is a lesson in courage, one that reminds us that dignity is our most lasting inheritance. No matter how much you've given, you have the right to peace, to respect, and to freedom from manipulation. If you've ever felt overlooked or unappreciated by those closest to you, let Stephen's stand inspire your own. Your worth is not measured in dollars, but in the life you've lived. Subscribe for more stories like this and share your thoughts in the comments. We want to hear your voice.